Welcome to African Folktales by Tammy. Please don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more interesting stories. Also share this story to someone who might be interested. Let's get into the story. Chima Okafor was a man of simple tastes and modest ambitions. Born and raised in the small town of Obibiri, he had learned early on the value of hard work and humility. He worked as a clerk in a local printing press, earning just enough to cover his basic needs. Despite his limited income, Chima was known for his warm smile and kind heart. One rainy afternoon, while waiting for a bus at a crowded stop, Chima met Teresa, a young school teacher from the neighboring village of Ikenbu. Drenched and shivering, she stood under a flimsy umbrella that barely shielded her from the downpour. Without hesitation, Chima offered to share his umbrella, and in that fleeting moment, their paths intertwined. The conversation flowed naturally, and they discovered a shared passion for literature and simple joys. It wasn't long before Chima found himself making detours just to see her after work. Teresa, with her quiet strength and radiant smile, became the light in his modest world. Their love blossomed, and soon they decided to marry despite their meager resources. Their wedding was a simple affair in the small church of St. Anya. Friends and family gathered to celebrate their union. Together, Chima and Teresa built a life filled with laughter and hope, despite their financial struggles. They rented a one-bedroom apartment in the outskirts of Obibiri and took on various jobs to make ends meet. Though their salaries were small, their happiness was immeasurable. Teresa's unwavering support fueled Chima's dreams, while his love provided her the strength to face each day. They became the envy of all, a couple whose bond seemed unbreakable. Little did they know, their story was only beginning, and life was about to test the very foundation of their love. It was an ordinary Wednesday when Chima's life took an extraordinary turn. He had been tasked with delivering some documents to a client's office. The client, Mr. Obiora, was a wealthy businessman known for his shrewdness. As fate would have it, their meeting stretched into an impromptu conversation about an upcoming government contract. Chima, always observant, spotted a flaw in the project proposal and casually pointed it out. Impressed by Chima's insight, Mr. Obiora offered him an opportunity to manage a section of the project. It was a chance Chima couldn't refuse, even though it meant stepping into unfamiliar territory. Teresa was ecstatic when she heard the news. She celebrated her husband's breakthrough, reassuring him he was capable of rising to the occasion. With her encouragement, Chima took on the project, dedicating himself to its success. Weeks turned into months, and the hard work paid off. The deal brought Chima unimaginable wealth. The once humble couple moved into a luxurious apartment in the upscale district of Ilubara. They began taking vacations to exotic locations, and their lifestyle became the talk of the town. Chima was showered with praises and invitations to high-profile events. But amidst the glamour, a shadow began to creep into their relationship. At first it was subtle, a dismissive tone here, a frustrated sigh there. Chima's newfound confidence began to border on arrogance. He started seeing himself as superior to the people around him, including Teresa. The man who once treasured her sacrifices now barely noticed them. Teresa, however, clung to the hope that this was a phase. She told herself he was simply overwhelmed by the sudden changes in their lives. But the cracks in their perfect life were growing, and soon they would become impossible to ignore. The changes in Chima were gradual at first. He started spending long hours away from home, immersed in meetings and high-profile networking events. The once attentive husband who called Teresa during lunch breaks and brought her flowers on random evenings now seemed like a stranger. He grew irritable, snapping at her over trivial matters. One evening, after an opulent dinner party hosted by one of Chima's new business associates in Olorin Heights, Teresa noticed something unsettling. Chima spoke about her as though she were an accessory to his success rather than his partner. He boasted about how he had elevated her life, casually brushing off her contributions. The words stung, but Teresa masked her hurt with a polite smile. At home, she confronted him. "Chima, don't you think you've changed? You barely talk to me like you used to." He sighed, his tone dismissive. "Teresa, you don't understand the pressure I'm under. I'm doing all this for us, can't you see that?" But she couldn't. What she saw was a man consumed by his new status, drifting further from the humility that once defined him. Yet she remained patient, hoping he would return to the man she fell in love with. The situation worsened when Chima began disrespecting the people closest to them. He humiliated his younger brother at a family gathering, calling him a waste of space for not pursuing a corporate career. He insulted Teresa's friends during a dinner she had organized, mocking their small-minded aspirations. Teresa apologized on his behalf, making excuses to cover for his behavior. "He's just adjusting to this new life," she explained, though the doubt in her voice betrayed her. Her friends weren't convinced. "Teresa, this isn't the man you married," one of them warned. "Be careful before he destroys everything you've built together." Teresa dismissed their concerns, clinging to the belief that this phase would pass. But as the weeks turned into months, her optimism began to wane. One night, after Chima returned home late from another lavish party, Teresa tried to rekindle their bond. She had prepared his favorite meal and set up the dining table with candles. But when he walked in and saw her efforts, he scoffed. "Do you think this is what I need after the kind of day I've had? You should focus on being more useful instead of wasting time on this." The words cut deeper than he could have imagined. Teresa excused herself, retreating to the bedroom where she cried silently into her pillow. The man who once held her hand during her darkest days now seemed intent on breaking her spirit. Outside their home, Chima's paranoia began to grow. He was suspicious of anyone who disagreed with him, often accusing his employees of plotting against him. Teresa tried to reason with him, but her words fell on deaf ears. "People are envious of us, Teresa. They want to see us fail," he insisted one evening. "You should be grateful I'm protecting you." But Teresa wasn't sure who he was protecting anymore, her or his own inflated ego. Deep inside, she began to question if the man she once adored even existed. Still, she resolved to fight for their marriage, hoping against hope that Chima would wake up before it was too late. The first public incident happened at a charity gala in Egbaluni Hall, where Chima was the keynote speaker. Teresa, ever the supportive wife, stood by his side in a modest yet elegant dress. She had carefully prepared herself for the event, wanting to represent their union with pride. But Chima's eyes were critical. "Couldn't you have chosen something more sophisticated?" he whispered harshly as they entered the venue. Teresa, taken aback, forced a smile and said nothing. During his speech, Chima acknowledged several people who had supported his rise but failed to mention Teresa. The omission didn't go unnoticed by the audience. When one of the hosts asked Teresa to say a few words about her husband, she hesitated, unsure of what to say. "Chima is an incredible man," she managed, her voice faltering. "He has worked hard for everything he has achieved." Instead of thanking her, Chima interrupted. "Let's not overdo it, Teresa. I think they get the point." Laughter rippled through the crowd, but Teresa felt the heat of humiliation rise to her cheeks. She excused herself and spent the rest of the evening in the restroom, fighting back tears. At home, she confronted him once again. "Chima, why would you embarrass me like that? Don't you care about how I feel?" He brushed her off. "You're being overly sensitive. If you can't handle these events, maybe you should stay home next time." Teresa began to feel trapped. The man who once celebrated her now seemed intent on diminishing her. Despite her efforts to please him, cooking his favorite meals, attending every event, and supporting his endeavors, nothing seemed to satisfy him. The breaking point came one evening at a family dinner. Chima, frustrated over a minor issue, lashed out at Teresa in front of everyone. "If you weren't so useless, maybe I wouldn't have to work this hard to keep everything together." The room fell silent. Teresa's mother, who had always adored Chima, looked on with disappointment. "Chima, is this how you treat the woman who stood by you when you had nothing?" Instead of apologizing, Chima doubled down. Maybe she should remember that if it weren't for me, she'd still be living in a one-room apartment. Teresa couldn't take it anymore. That night, as Chima snored beside her, oblivious to her pain, she began packing her bags. She would not wait for him to destroy what was left of her dignity. The decision to leave was not an easy one for Teresa. She sat in the dim-lit room, her suitcase open on the bed, staring at the life she was about to leave behind. Photographs of their early days, their simple wedding, their small apartment filled with laughter, mocked her from the bedside table. A single tear rolled down her cheek as she folded her clothes into the suitcase. For months she had tried to endure Chima's outbursts and humiliations, believing that the man she married would resurface. But now it was clear to her. The man she loved was gone, buried beneath layers of arrogance and greed. Staying any longer would only destroy the remnants of her self-respect. Teresa knew she couldn't leave without a plan. She spent days preparing in secret, transferring small amounts of money into her personal account, and researching rental apartments in Okitem, a quiet town far from the chaos of Ilubara. She spoke to no one, fearing that word would reach Chima before she was ready. On the night she decided to leave, Chima was in one of his usual foul moods. He had spent the evening ranting about an employee who had dared to challenge him in a meeting. Teresa listened in silence, her heart racing as she mentally rehearsed her exit. As he poured himself another glass of wine, she mustered the courage to speak. "Chima, don't you think it's time we took a break? Maybe some time away from all this pressure would do us good." He shot her a disdainful look. "Don't start with your lectures, Teresa. If you can't handle this life, maybe you should leave." The irony of his words wasn't lost on her. She smiled faintly and nodded. "You're right," she said softly, turning away before he could see the tears welling up in her eyes. That night, as Chima snored in their luxurious king-sized bed, Teresa made her move. She left a handwritten note on his bedside table, a simple farewell that read, "Chima, I have loved you with all my heart, but I can no longer endure the man you've become. I hope one day you realize what you've lost. Goodbye." With her suitcase in hand, Teresa slipped out of the apartment and into the waiting cab. The city lights blurred past her as the driver sped toward Okitem. She didn't look back, afraid that one glance might weaken her resolve. The next morning, Chima woke to an empty bed. At first, he thought Teresa had gone to the market or to visit a friend. But as the hours passed and she didn't return, he began to grow suspicious. It wasn't until he found her note that the reality hit him. For the first time in months, Chima felt a pang of something he hadn't experienced in a long time: regret. He read the note over and over, the words burning into his consciousness. "She left me," he muttered to himself, disbelief clouding his voice. Teresa wouldn't just leave. But she had, and as he looked around the empty apartment, the weight of his actions began to sink in. Teresa, his constant source of support, was gone. Chima's mind raced. He tried calling her phone, but it was switched off. He contacted her friends and family, but none of them knew where she had gone, or so they claimed. For the first time in his life, Chima felt powerless, a man adrift without the anchor that had once steadied him. As the hours turned into days, Chima's despair deepened. He realized that no amount of wealth or success could fill the void Teresa had left behind. But the worst was yet to come. The days following Teresa's departure were a blur for Chima. He tried to distract himself with work, but his concentration wavered. The same associates who once flattered him now whispered behind his back. Rumors of his wife's departures spread through Ilubara, tarnishing his carefully crafted image. At first, Chima refused to acknowledge the problem. "She'll be back," he told himself repeatedly. "Teresa's just being dramatic." But as weeks passed without a word from her, the reality became impossible to ignore. One morning, during a board meeting at his office in the Obiloma Tower, Chima's temper exploded. An intern had accidentally spilled coffee on some documents, and Chima lashed out with such venom that several employees walked out in protest. Mr. Okafor, one of his senior managers, said after the meeting, "You need to get your act together. You're losing respect, not just at home, but here too." The words stung, but Chima dismissed them. "I don't need anyone's respect," he snapped. "I built this empire myself," but cracks were forming in his so-called empire. Clients began pulling out of contracts, citing his erratic behavior. His most trusted employees resigned one by one, unable to tolerate his increasingly volatile outbursts. At night, alone in his once grand apartment, Chima's thoughts turned to Teresa. He replayed every argument, every cruel word, every moment he had taken her for granted. The guilt was overwhelming, but his pride refused to let him admit he had been wrong. "She'll come back," he muttered to himself. though deep down he knew the truth. Teresa was gone, and it was entirely his fault. The loneliness crept in like an unwelcome guest, filling every corner of Chima's once vibrant apartment. The walls, adorned with expensive paintings and decor, felt cold and empty. The echo of Teresa's laughter, once a comforting melody, now tormented him in the silence. Nights were the hardest. Sleep evaded him, and when it came, it brought nightmares, visions of Teresa walking away while he stood paralyzed, unable to call her back. Chima threw himself into work, trying to drown the guilt that gnawed at him. But the universe had other plans. His company began to crumble under the weight of his poor decisions. Contracts were terminated without explanation, and legal battles loomed over him like dark clouds. Employees he had once trusted whispered of his erratic behavior, and soon even his most loyal investors began pulling out. One evening, after a grueling day of damage control, Chima found himself sitting alone in his dimly lit living room. A bottle of whiskey sat on the table, half empty. His hands trembled as he stared at his reflection in the glass coffee table. The man who once inspired others with his humility and kindness was now a shadow of himself. He reached for his phone, scrolling through old pictures of him and Teresa. There was one from their honeymoon in Egbudu Falls, where they had laughed until their stomachs ached. The memory hit him like a tidal wave, and for the first time in years, Chima allowed himself to cry. "I was a fool," he whispered to the empty room. "I had everything and I ruined it." In a moment of desperation, he dialed her number. He knew it was futile. Her phone had been switched off for months, but he needed to try. The robotic voice on the other end confirmed what he already knew. "The number you are trying to call is not reachable at the moment." Frustrated, he threw the phone across the room, the sound of it shattering echoing through the apartment. The act brought no relief, only a deeper sense of despair. Meanwhile, in Okitem, Teresa was slowly rebuilding her life. She had rented a small but cozy apartment overlooking the quiet hills. With her teaching credentials, she secured a job at a local school and quickly won the hearts of her students. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of peace. But the scars of her past lingered. At night, she would sit by the window, staring into the distance, her thoughts inevitably drifting to Chima. Despite everything he had put her through, a part of her still loved him. She wondered if he had changed, if he regretted his actions. But then she would remember the humiliation, the pain and the tears, and she would steel herself. "He made his choice," she would tell herself, "and I've made mine." One day, while sorting through her belongings, Teresa found a forgotten keepsake, a leather-bound journal Chima had gifted her on their first anniversary. Inside were pages filled with her handwritten notes, dreams, and memories of their early days. Tears blurred her vision as she read through them, but she quickly wiped them away. She had built a new life, and there was no room for regrets. Still, a nagging thought lingered. Would he ever truly understand what he had lost? Chima, oblivious to Teresa's new life, became consumed with finding her. He hired private investigators, offering exorbitant fees to anyone who could track her down. But Teresa had been careful. She had changed her name in the records, moved to a town where no one knew her, and severed all ties to her old life. The more Chima searched, the more desperate he became. His obsession with finding her began to overshadow everything else. Meetings were missed, projects delayed, and soon his company teetered on the brink of bankruptcy. One fateful night, Chima received a call from his lawyer. "Mr. Okafor, we need to discuss your financial situation. If you don't act quickly, you could lose everything." "I've already lost everything," Chima muttered before hanging up. But even as his empire crumbled, his thoughts remained fixed on Teresa. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was the key to saving not just his life but his soul. Months passed, and Chima's life continued to spiral downward. He sold his luxurious apartment in Ilubara and moved into a modest flat in Ogoli Estate. The lavish cars, the designer suits, the opulent lifestyle, all of it was gone. But the emptiness remained. One morning, as he walked through the bustling streets of Ogoli, Chima stumbled upon a small bookstore. Drawn in by nostalgia, he wandered through the aisles until he found himself in the poetry section. There, on a dusty shelf, was a book Teresa had loved, Songs of the Heart. He picked it up and leafed through the pages, memories flooding back. He turned to the final page and found an inscription. To my dearest Teresa, may our love always be our greatest poem. Chima. The words hit him like a thunderbolt. For the first time, Chima fully understood the depth of what he had lost. It wasn't just Teresa's love, it was the life they had built together, the dreams they had shared. In that moment, Chima made a vow. He would rebuild his life not to win her back, but to honor the woman who had once believed in him. He would become the man she had always seen in him, even if she never returned. Far away in Okitem, Teresa stood by her window watching the sunset. A faint smile played on her lips as she thought of the future. She didn't know where Chima was or what had become of him, but she no longer dwelled on the past. Her life was hers to live, and she was determined to make the most of it. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, two souls forever intertwined yet worlds apart began their journeys anew. We've come to the end of this story. Please subscribe to my channel to support me. Thank you.